are talking about the movie Wronged, which comes to us from Indican Pictures on the 26th of February 2019 on VOD and DVD. Now this one is written and directed by Nicholas Holland, and I would say this movie can be best described as Wrong Turn meets Reservoir Dogs. Now this movie asks you the question, do two wrongs make a right? The story here focuses on this family. Now we have our main character within this family, this guy and his wife, and they have going through a little bit of a marital problems because the wife has recently had a miscarriage, and they're going through counselling, etc. So the two of them, their two kids, go out on a hunting / camping trip with the guy's dad, brother, and the brother's wife. So there's a reasonable amount of them. So they're out then in the woods, camping and hunting and doing all that kind of stuff. However, they seem to cross paths with a group of criminals who have just ripped off some corrupt policemen for a large chunk of money. And these two groups of people's paths cross, and the youngest member of this family is killed, and two of the members are taken hostage. And then we have this issue with this family. What are they to do? They can't call for the police for some reason. What do? They run away. They try and get help. They try and go after these criminals themselves and try and get justice for their the dead member of their family and get the two hostages back. And then the criminals themselves, they have to decide what to do about these these guys they've left. So they don't want to leave any witnesses because obviously they've just committed a murder right in front of them. So ultimately, it's a clash between these these two groups of people in a violent and bloody fashion. So let's talk about Wrong. Let's talk about what worked first. What worked for me first of all here. One of the things that stood out for me the most was the level of violence in this movie. I was surprised how utterly brutal this movie is, but it does it in a way where it implies a lot of violence rather than actually showing you quite a lot on screen. Now, what happens, without giving away too many spoilers here, is ultimately there's people dying within this movie, and there's also a reasonable amount of torture and painful deaths. And our two groups of characters almost one-up themselves by inflicting pain upon the other on the other group. So although you don't really see a lot on screen here, the implied violence is very strong and actually quite to the point where it's like, damn, it almost affects you to a certain degree. So it's quite a powerful movie in that regard. The other thing I want to say here, I was just very intrigued about where the movie was going to end up, and what will be the status quo at the end of the film here, because I felt like it sets it up in a way where there has to be some type of it can't be open ended until there has to be a definitive ending with whoever's left ultimately. And I was intrigued to see how it would play out, who would be left left standing. And I've got to say, when we get to our very final conflict within the movie, I was impressed that the fact that the movie dared to go in a direction where I felt was very risque, and but it was again quite powerful in its own right. So that was some people may be put off with the ending, but I actually thought it had the balls to pull off its conviction, what it's set out to do, or a certain character says what they're going to do at the beginning of the movie. It doesn't work for me. There's a few things I would say that bother me a fair amount on this movie. Two things in particular, and there's a few minor bits. So for me, I feel the biggest one that I feel people will be put off on is some of the acting here is got on the weaker side, and it's the majority of the cast. It's not if there's one or two weaker characters here. There's a lot of poor acting from a good portion of the cast, unfortunately, and it doesn't help. The dialogue here is sometimes very hammy. So although not everyone is suffers, there is unfortunately a fair amount of what seems to be very amateur line delivery. People who seem very unsure in front of the camera, very not unconfident, and then other people who overact and are like, oh man, it just comes across as a little cheesy in times. So I've got to say the acting for me wasn't strong. The other thing I would say is the writing I don't think was particularly strong here, because the movie just asks you to swallow quite a lot, if you ask me. And just without kind of trying to give away too much about the film, I'm going to give you one scene where it bothers me, and poor writing, if you ask me. So we have the scene where these two groups first meet. Is we have this group of criminals who are walking through the forest for some reason. I mean, this is an organised group of criminals with professional kind of, well, they're killers, so they've obviously done stuff like this before. They've got, you know, high-grade weapons, etc. This is not an organised group. But they don't really seem to have a particularly good exit strategy. They seem to be walking through the forest is their plan. And then when they come across, if you just committed a crime, including murder, you're going to be somewhat kind of careful about where you're going. But they just seem to haphazardly kind of like cross paths with this kind of group of campers. And even then, what do they do? Not try and kind of just say nothing and just kind of walk on. No, they confront them for no real reason. I mean, if you were this kind of guy, these criminals who had just kind of like committed a robbery, and then you're walking through the forest, there's plenty of where to go where you can not avoid people, but you just happen to walk straight into this camp of campers. It just seems silly. There should have been a scene here where I felt like just to show that these guys literally run across to it and kind of bumped into each other, not like it was where they just seem to have purposely just haven't cared and wandered through this kind of like these kind of group of people without any masks on, revealing one of them's got a sister called Michelle. It just seems silly. You know, and then we're led to believe that no one's got any phones, or the phones don't work, no one's got any cars that are working. You know, it's just, come on. So there's some sloppy writing here, and that's just kind of one example. But there is some, unfortunately, some poor writing here. So they're the two major things for me. However, there are a couple of minor issues that I had as well. I mentioned the level of violence, but don't be expected to see very much on screen here, because the camera cuts away nearly every time. So although there's a lot of implied violence, it gets a little bit frustrating where the camera is kind of constantly kind of looking in a different direction while something's happening. Now that might work, I feel, and I think you can do that and have it be effective if you don't overdo it. But when you do it nearly every time, it becomes a bit frustrating and a little bit you feel like they're avoiding having to have special effects on and stuff like that. And I've got to say, certainly in those scenes, the editing is quite poor. So there's some poor editing. There's also some poor camera work here. There's a few scenes here that are unfocused, and just look like the camera positioning wasn't particularly great. The director, I feel, has makes some decisions where I think he wants to be kind of like tries to be poignant / arty. There's a couple of scenes where we have a bit of a kind of a monologue go across, and we have someone kind of silently scream. It looks stupid. It just looks really cheesy. But it's meant to be this kind of like poignant music, but it's like, you know, emotional kind of depth and all that. But it just looks kind of really. It is ultimately very cheesy. For me, this movie has a kind of an amateurish feel to it. People who haven't had a lot of experience. I haven't looked, if I'm honest, about what the kind of experiences behind these guys. But to me, it had a very kind of like they haven't done a lot of this before. And it kind of shows on screen because of that. So the premise ultimately is kind of interesting, and I like the fact this movie almost goes in directions where I feel a lot of them don't. But the actual execution of to make a kind of an entertaining movie with kind of believable characters, you know, with good writing and stuff isn't there. It's by no means a car crash. But it's a weaker film, if you ask me. Still watchable to a certain degree if you kind of like gangster films, action films, maybe with a kind of a you know, a woodland twist, so to speak. But it's on the weaker side, although not a complete write-off. So I'll have to give this one a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.